Yep, so I'm Ross Stirling. I'm joined by Alethea and Jess, so you won't hear from me for the whole hour, particularly seeing how you want to hear how facilities are being used. So the plan is I'm going to give a bit of an overview and then hand over. So the National Green Infrastructure Facility is a bit of a mouthful. So from now on, I'm going to use NGIF for short. Just stops me falling over the words every single time I say it. So the plan is I'm going to give a bit of an overview on UKCRIC, although I appreciate the crowd already know what that's about, but more specifically on the location of our facilities, what it comprises, and then finally how we've started using it. So to do that, I'm going to talk about 3 different projects. So Plexus being one that's looking at the net zero side of things, so a bit of energy and green infrastructure. Achilles, which is more sort of climate and infrastructure interaction, and UGDAMS, which is looking more specifically at SuDs, so sustainable drainage systems. Finally, I'll move on to a bit of the monitoring, which is key, so gathering the data, and then also how we share that data so that people can make better use of it. Hopefully someone in the audience might find it useful as well. So UKCRIC, so as we all know, it's a series of facilities and capability underpinning research into the understanding and improvement of infrastructure in cities. This map is probably slightly out of date. I know it's a growing network, but we're sort of at the top right up here in the northeast of the UK. I'm getting a laser pointer, that might help. Yep, so we're up here. For a while, we were out on a limb, out on our own up here, but more recently joined by our colleagues in Edinburgh. And we're one of the longest running facilities. So it was back in 2015, we were told we'd been successful in the grant and got just shy of £10 million to develop our facilities. We got the keys to the facility in 2017, so we've actually been running for quite a while now, but officially opened just in the nick of time in January 2020. Little did we know how things would turn out. But at the time, we opened up and already had a few projects on the go, both funded from UKCRIC, predominantly EPSRC funded, but also with PhD projects as well. So that's where we are and how long we've been going. So officially, we're towards the end of our 3rd year, but actually we've been sort of going for sort of 5 years or so. So what it actually comprises, we're on the Helix site. So this is Newcastle city centre, a former open cast colliery site, then a brewery, so Newcastle Brown Ale and the like, people might be aware of. That site got redeveloped and it's still being redeveloped. And it's a mixed use site, comprises university buildings, so in the pale green, if you can call it pale green, yeah, in the three buildings there. The lower lot are more commercial and spin-off companies, and then the top right is yet to be delivered, which is a residential site. It's undeveloped plot so far. But what you've got here is the master plan, and it's largely going to plan so far as what buildings are aware. But the key message here is how much green infrastructure there is across the site. We're to the north and just up towards the upper catchment of the city centre. So we're a prime location to intercept flows making its way from the upper catchment into the city centre and ultimately down to the River Tyne. The site already comprises lots of different green features. So these are features that are designed to take excess surface water off the pavements and neighbouring roadways for the purposes of reducing inflow into combined sewer networks, but also providing some sort of remediation, so collecting pollutants, but also amenity as well. These are spaces where people work and live ultimately. So there are lots of multiple benefits to the features in there. And you've got here a few photos of the types of features. In fact, top left is Alethea, already showing off green walls to other students. So there are lots of features to sort of highlight. But more specifically, our facility, this is more likely what it looks like actually now. What you see here, so we're in this building here. This is the Urban Sciences building, this triangular building, and where we're mainly based with most of our features, they're external. So unlike a lot of the labs in UKCRIC, having large buildings of their own, and particularly seems to be a running theme of large holes in the ground across UKCRIC facilities, our holes in the ground are external. because the whole point is we want to be able to expose our experiments to natural conditions, and there are certain types of conditions that we can't simulate at scale internally inside a building. Whereas rainfall, we can add water, but what we found in the last couple of years is the gift of, although I didn't feel like it at the time, heat waves and extreme heat and drought. That sort of condition at scale it's very difficult to replicate. So having our features outside the building really helps us out there. So we've got several features around, and I'll take you one by one, but we're largely looking at this swale feature here and a series of in-ground units here, in-ground plots, and some lysimeters, some above ground planters out here. One thing to point out with this view, though, is this is the undeveloped residential catchment that we're able to take runoff from here and into our swale. So we're actually providing a functional, sustainable drainage facility to the whole site in general. So it's not just for the science, it's not just for monitoring things, it's also monitoring live, in real time, actual functioning SuDs. So this is a clearer top-down view of the building, and just for the purposes of labeling, we'll go with the artist's impression. So what I'll do is take you very briefly through the various features we've got here before moving on to the projects that make use of them. So to start with, we've got the ensembles. So these are a collection, it's ensemble, of different treatments. So in ground, as you can see in the image down here, these are lined trenches, lined plots, which we fill with various soil types. This picture on the right is a carbon capture substrate, so a crushed concrete with sand, and different plots are for different experiments. I'm sure Alethea will talk to you about those in a moment. But they run up the entire side of one of the pavements, taking runoff from some of the neighbouring pavement, but largely we're able to control or at least establish the inflow there with being incident rainfall. And these are heavily instrumented, so every 50 meters or so there's a chamber like this, and in there we have data connections, so a fibre optic data connection, mains power, water being rainwater harvested and from the building, and Cat 5 mains water. So that's where a lot of the electronics and the data logging is held for all of these experiments, and predominantly they're long-term prospects. So we're looking at setting up experiments and leaving them out there for a number of years. Only that way do you actually capture both seasonality, but also into annual events that may be extreme or of particular note. So there are 6 of these plots and planted up in different styles, running up the pavement. Then we have lysimeters, so outside the building again, on the pavement. These are isolated, controlled systems, so we're very confident of what the inflow is there. It is purely incident rainfall, the rainfall that lands on them. But that means we're able to calculate mass flows, mass balances really more accurately, rather than if it was at ground taking water from the whole pavement features, then we wouldn't be entirely sure how much water and what the composition of that water was as it entered our system. We have weather stations. You can see one on this lysimeter here, but we have 10 of these features with 3 weather stations up and down the pavement, because we're in quite a wind canyon up against the building here, and so we're able to get the variation of rainfall that occurs up and down the street. Again, there's data, so data logging, power, water for these experiments, all provided at each facility, each unit, each lysimeter, and they're various shapes and sizes. So they're largely sort of 2 meters by 2 meters for the square ones, 2 meter diameter for the circular ones, and we've got some much larger 3 meter ones. Internally, we have a relatively small SuDs lab, so SuDs being sustainable drainage systems, and it's in here we do a lot of the sort of soil physics testing, so soil water retention, and we have an environment chamber looking at controlling temperature and humidity and light. We can also grow samples in there. Being a green infrastructure facility, we also want to be able to capture conditions conducive to vegetation growth and the behaviour that produces in the soil or controls. We also have a storeroom off camera from this image, but that's where we house a lot of equipment that goes outside, is used and comes back in. So not all of our equipment's mounted outside, because it is the public domain, and we're already experienced the trials and tribulations of putting expensive equipment out on the pavements in the middle of Newcastle. So we have a lot of kit indoors that we deploy as and when we need it on a project by project basis. Then we also have a green roof. So up on the, I think it's the 3rd floor of the Urban Sciences building, is our green roof, and that's been historically monitored for through flow, so it all tilts to one end. That's quite convenient for us to be able to capture what flows off, but also there are moisture content sensors and temperature sensors and things on there, and is generally a nice place to be with a nice view. And then the largest feature on site, so as I've mentioned before, is this functional swale. What we have here is the ability to capture actual events, but also simulate our own. So to the right, let's see if I can point. Yep. So to the right of this video here is a catchment basin, a reservoir, if you will, lined with bentonite liner that holds water, so that we can release it from a sluice gate in this top photo here and allow a wave to propagate down. And what we're looking at particularly here are these leaky barriers. So we're trying to slow the flow of water and extend the amount of time that that water is attenuated within the feature, which both slows down the amount of water making it into the drainage system, but also allows for infiltration while the water's resident in the feature. At the bottom as well, probably best viewed in the video that's stopped just now, but is the wetland as well. That's not actively monitored, it's not part of any active ongoing research as yet, but it's just generally a nice place to be. We need use it as a balancing pond for the experiments further up the swale, but also it's wonderful habitat. We've got ducks that come down here, people that come down and have their lunch sat around it on the benches. So so although it's not an active part of the research, it's a key part of green infrastructure on the site. So 3 projects I'll just briefly touch on. It's Plexus. So this was a UKCRIC pump priming project. So there are various Plexus projects at different UKCRIC facilities. Ours was looking at ground source heat in green infrastructure. So at the moment, we're heavily biased towards the use of natural gas for heating and cooling. And it costs more to cool than it does to heat. And I've worked that out in the last couple of years with heat waves, and people have been desperate to provide active cooling. Here we're using SuDs where we're actively wetting the ground. Great increased high thermal conductivity. It's great for dispersing heat. So here we're combining the 2 features, the 2 technologies of SuDs and ground source heat. So we set up a lysimeter experiment here. So this is Anil Yildiz, who was a researcher with us at the time, setting up an experiment whereby we're putting in a heat source, so a heated cable, and pulling pulses of heat through the wetted soil. And it enables us to look at how that heat is propagated through the lysimeter. Next, there we go, is Achilles. So here we're looking particularly at desiccation cracking, so the drying effect and shrinking of our clay infrastructure, particularly used in slopes. And here we're mapping how the cracks change. And just in this project, I will just point out using thermal imaging on the bottom right there to look at whether we can sense warming and therefore drying and ultimately formation of cracking and deterioration of the soil. But in that bottom photo is our rainfall simulator as well, where we're able to, as I mentioned before, create the conditions of design storms. And the final project, hopefully the slide will change, yes, is green dams, so urban green design and modelling of SuDs. So here looking at different vegetation styles, and different orifice controls, so controlling the amount of water that can flow out of the outlets, and different soil types, all to see if we can better understand and then engineer better SuDs. So this is Daniel Green, who is a researcher who's just moved on to Heriot Watt, so I think he might be involved in UKCRIC activities up there as well. And very finally is the data side of things. So just to point out and highlight, these experiments and things are in the past, but we've generated a lot of data from this and ongoing data. And what we'd like to do is share that, so it's completely open access. You can access it both via our app, so ngif.ncl.ac.uk, but also an API. So we're trying to put it in a user-friendly format for more digital solutions. So with an API, we're able to integrate that better into the likes of digital twins and things. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in any of these experiments or anything environmental data-wise in the city centre, in an urban area, this is be a great asset for that. So do get in touch. On the subject of getting in touch, there are various channels and means by which you can do so. Naturally got Twitter, or should I say X, but our link tree is probably the better one to go to. That gives links to all the different resources we've got available online, or just email us at greeninfrastructure@newcastle.ac.uk. Right. On that note, I will pass over to Alethea, and you can actually hear how the facility is actually being used in PhD research. So over to you, Alethea. I will stop sharing.
Thank you. Yeah, so my name is Alethea Goddard, and I'm one of the PhD researchers at NGIF. I'm in the final year of my PhD. My PhD is also part of the Water Infrastructure and Resilience, or WIRE, Centre for Doctoral Training, which is a collaboratorium between Newcastle, Sheffield and Cranfield, which also hosts UKCRIC facilities. And then my research is sponsored by Northumbria Water, which I think is a really great example of how the facility works with wider stakeholders in the Northeast. So all of my research focuses mainly on green infrastructure and resilience. So firstly, I thought it was important to sort of introduce you all to the concept of a rain garden. Apologies to anybody in the audience who is aware of green infrastructure features and components and knows the ins and outs of rain gardens, but just in case people don't, rain gardens, they're also called bioretention features, and they're a more sort of flexible approach to managing stormwater. The idea being that they collect rainwater where it falls, they hold it into a porous soil media, and then they slowly release it into the wider environment. So a really big thing with natural flood management and green infrastructure and sustainable drainage systems is slowing the flow. You might have heard that term before, and basically what it means is that we catch water at the point that it becomes a problem, at the point of rainfall, or in natural flood management, sometimes where a river basin might break its banks, and we hold the water there before we slowly release it to an environment. And the idea behind this is not necessarily to stop flooding, because we can never really stop flooding, but the idea is to alleviate flooding. So it's holding water back from a system that can't cope with the water. And in the case of rain gardens, preferably where they're infiltrating to the ground, it means that we can replenish our groundwater systems and help create nice, healthy ecosystems. So I personally think rain gardens are the best form of a green infrastructure feature, partially because of how adaptable they are. So they can be retrofit to existing properties. So in the bottom right, you can see some quite funky drain pipes that are going down into some raised planters. So these are still rain gardens, and they'll have an overflow pipe at the bottom to release into the wider environment. And then in the picture above is a picture of Greater Green in Sheffield, which is a very large, long, linear rain garden system that takes water from runoff from a road and holds it back from the local riverbank. So my work focuses on using rain gardens, and the reason being that collectively, when we have a lot of rain gardens all together, they can make quite a big difference to cities. So now we understand sort of what green infrastructure components can do. It's important to understand why we're using them in our urban spaces. So in our urban spaces, we have lots of different challenges. So population growth, urbanisation, the biodiversity crisis, and I think arguably more pressingly, the climate crisis, the effects of which we've been feeling in the past 2 weeks with some of the storms that we've had. And green infrastructure is quite often seen as a solution to this, offering multifunctional solutions that can alleviate urban pressures. There are lots of wide benefits of green infrastructure, so carbon capture, they can provide cooling and shading, which can reduce the effect of the urban heat island. And so quite often they're seen as a really great solution, and sort of everything is lovely and happy. But I think what's really happening in our urban spaces is that we're using these green infrastructure components to alleviate these pressures, but then they're facing the very challenges that they're designed to solve, and quite often it's leading to failure. The failure can be down to lots of different reasons. It could be poor design, poor maintenance is a really big one, especially in the UK. Our maintenance bodies are not very functional, but also a lack of integration to its local environment. A one-size solution does not fit all when it comes to green infrastructure, and also like poor planting design. And so I'm trying to address this through my research, looking at the interdependencies of green infrastructure and resilience. So asking both what resilience can be built into green infrastructure, but also what resilience can be provided by green infrastructure. So one way that I'm trying to look at this is looking at planting choices. Something we still lack a true scientific understanding of is how the vegetation that we choose for our green infrastructure affects its functionality. We also don't know how resilient plants are to survive climatic extremes. And arguably, vegetation is the most important part of green infrastructure. It provides all our wider benefits that we sing about, amenity value, placemaking, mental health benefits, biodiversity increase. All of these really rely on vegetation, and also the vegetation is what separates our green components with our grey counterparts, so our pipes, our storage systems, our storage tanks. And so we need to understand more about how the plants we use affects functionality and also how it affects the longevity of those components. So I'm doing this by comparing 3 different planting regimes and how they affect the performance of a rain garden feature. So firstly, I'm looking at amenity grass, and this is to sort of capture our typical amenity spaces in our urban landscapes. So perhaps playing fields, your private lawn, different roadside infrastructure, so verges, roundabouts, but also we use it quite often in green infrastructure and sustainable drainage components. So the swale that Ross spoke about earlier and the wetland both have grass components. And also you've probably seen on a new development site, there's a large attenuation basin at the front of it that takes all the storage water, and that'll be planted with grass. So this is then compared to the typical plants that we currently use in rain gardens. So the plant guidance we currently use comes from horticultural experts, and I'm absolutely not undermining what the experts provide, but we don't have much science behind what they're doing, and I'd like to be able to provide some science for them. But we have guidance from the Royal Horticultural Society or the RHS, the UK Rain Garden Guide, some other industry standard documents such as the Serious SuDs Manual. And then I also asked local landscape architects in Newcastle, and I used some of the planting regimes that have gone into developments locally. And then lastly, I'm comparing this to urban agriculture and edible herbs. So in our cities, as I said, we're asking a lot of our urban spaces, we're asking it to provide so much different functions. And urban agriculture is really on a rise at the moment. People want access to food, they want, especially with different things in globalization, making it harder to access food from different areas. We want to grow our own stuff, we want to grow it locally. But urban agriculture is on a very different path to green infrastructure, and there's not really a joined up approach. And so I wanted to understand better if we could link these 2 things together. I've chosen to use herbs rather than fruits and vegetables because fruits and vegetables have a lot of seasonality around them, and it makes it quite difficult to understand their impact on hydrology if we're constantly ripping them out of the soil, whereas herbs you're taking cuttings of, the plant itself, the structure of the plant really remains intact. So these 3 planting choices I'm comparing by running experiments at 2 different scales and comparing each one, each as a whole regime, to see how it affects performance. So firstly, there is a greenhouse that the facility own that I am using to understand the physiological responses of vegetation to climatic extremes. So the experiments that are conducted in here are in a semi-controlled environment because you can only control so much of the greenhouse, but it does allow climatic extremes to be explored. So firstly, it's extreme flooding, and then it's extreme drought or dry conditions. And within this, I'm looking at how the plants themselves respond to these conditions and also the system itself. So within the greenhouse, there are 3 experimental tubs that all planted with the same soil type. So within this experiment, as I spoke about earlier, rain gardens need a nice porous soil. So we're using a soil called Grey to Green, which was developed by Sheffield University, and it's a recycled media soil. So it uses recycled rubble and glass to make nice porous spaces, and then all of the soil itself has come from recycled organic matter from your food waste bins. And then this is all raised up, so there's a controlled outfall, and this means that the main thing I'm looking at, the main mechanism for managing water, is evapotranspiration. And then outside at Holmes Avenue, as Ross already spoke about, I'm using the ensemble plots. So this allows me to look at the rain gardens and how they're performing under natural weather conditions as opposed to the experimental conditions. And these schemes were planted in 2021 of the summer, and this has allowed me to have a really long-term data set of observation, and it also allowed for an establishment period. So typically in new developments, we have a year of establishment where we really sort of get involved with the plants and make sure they're settling in. And then after that, it's sort of when they're up to their own devices. And that's really the key bit that we don't understand much about, is because a lot of maintenance bodies aren't involved at that point. And it's the bit where they really need to start doing their work. And then by being under natural conditions, as Ross alluded to earlier, I've got to see the impact of some of the extreme weather that we're already experiencing as a result of climate change. So this was from the heat wave last year, and you can see that the grass absolutely did not survive at all. And then on the far right, we've got the herbs. You can see there's a lot of yellow, which is an indication of vegetative death. But then in the middle, the rain garden plants actually are coping quite well with the drought. So in order to understand how all of this is working and how it's all working together, I'm monitoring the soil plant atmosphere interactions. And these interactions is what provides the functionality of green infrastructure and what makes it different from its grey bits. So to monitor the soil, there are 3 different sensor types that are both in the greenhouse and the ensemble plots outside. And these monitor soil moisture content and soil water potential, which is the ability of soil to move from the soil to the plant. Water, sorry, to move from the soil to the plant. And then also in the greenhouse, I'm using a soil oxygen meter. This allows me to look at how flooding affects the root structures of plants, because the problem with flooding and waterlogging is that it deprives the plant of oxygen, which affects respiration. Within all the soil profiles, the sensors are dotted throughout the profile, so I can understand how water is moving both laterally and vertically. And then considering the plants themselves, to take you all back to high school biology, I'm looking at barometers. I'm using a barometer to monitor stomatal conductance. So the stomata of the plant helps to control the release of water vapour. And when a plant's quite stressed out, the stomata will stay closed, like the left image. When it's nice and happy and everything is going well, it will be open on the right and release water vapour. So the barometer measures the stomatal conductance. It measures how the stomatas are open or closed, and it also measures leaf temperature, which is a really good indication of how stressed the plants are, and therefore indicating how resilient they are to these extreme conditions. And then lastly, in the atmosphere, we're using atmospheric sensors to understand evapotranspiration and estimate evapotranspiration, and then also the rain gauges on site. By having rain gauges directly on the site, it gives a much more accurate depiction of what rainfall is likely falling in. And then, as I said earlier, the greenhouse tubs are all lined and they have a monitored outfall. It's the same with the ensemble plots, they're also lined with an outfall. So typically with rain gardens, we'd want them to be infiltrating, but in this case, by having them lined, we can monitor how much water is carrying the soil and how much water is actually being uptaken by the plants and managed by the plants themselves. So a tipping bucket counter, which is the middle image, is what's used here. So this is an example of some of the results that are coming out from my research, and this is the greenhouse experiments. And this was a flood of a 1% annual exceedance probability, or AEP, with a 45% uplift for climate change. And that just means it's a really extreme flood. There's a 1% chance of it occurring each year, and then we add on an uplift of climate change, because under climate change, flooding is likely to only get worse. And this is what we asked developers in the UK to manage within their developments. And so this is the flood that I chose to utilise in my work. And the main finding of this is that the rain garden planting performed best, retaining 46% of the floodwater. The herbs retained 35%, and the grass retained 23%. This flood also occurred after a successive drought condition. But basically what this says is that the status quo is best, that the rain garden plants are performing best. There's a slight concern because you can see on the bottom graph, so the grass is indicated by the green line, the rain garden is indicated by the blue line, the herbs are indicated by the yellow line. And the green and blue line have a much more flashy response, which basically means that they are releasing water quite quickly, and then the herbs are releasing it much slower. And obviously, as we spoke about earlier about slowing the flow, this is slightly concerning. So I think perhaps it's just a mix of planting is what's needed, of both rain gardens and sort of like more herbaceous plants. So overall, the facilities at NGIF have allowed me to consider the role of vegetation within green infrastructure and how this affects the functionality. And the outdoor facility creates quite a unique environment that are quite hard to recreate in a lab. But I also get to observe how the local environment interacts with the components. So this video is just a lot of bees. I feel like at one point I was hosting the entire bee population of Newcastle just in my herb plot alone. But also by being outside, I can interact with the public about the work that I do. We also have many different stakeholders that come and visit, from the Environment Agency, local government, national government. We've also had a lot of international visitors, and this means that I get the opportunity to sort of explain my research to the industry directly, and show people how green infrastructure could make a difference to their developments. So I'll pass you over to Jess now, who is going to talk about some of the work in the lysimeters.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I'm Jessica Holmes. I'm a research associate here at Newcastle University, and I've been based at the National Green Infrastructure Facility with Ross and Alethea and others as well for the last 2 years or so. And I use the facilities at NGIF for my research into composite barrier systems for climate adaptation. So firstly, just to provide a bit of context and justification for the research that I do, climate change is predicted to have a significant and negative effect on our urban spaces, and we're expected to see longer duration and higher intensity rainfall events more frequently in temperate regions like in the UK, where this research is based, and so flooding is likely to become a more frequent issue. As well as these extreme events, we're also expecting an increase in seasonality associated with hotter, drier summers and wetter winters, and that'll cause shrink swell behaviour, particularly in clay-rich soil, and that causes deformation at the surface. So you can see in this example here where the railway tracks have deformed at the surface. This sort of deformation also occurs in the subsurface, where our buried infrastructure, like pipes and foundations, are located. So there is therefore a need for climate adaptation solutions, and that is where composite barrier systems come in. Oh, okay, sorry. So what is a composite barrier system? Vegetated barrier systems, also known as capillary barrier systems, offer a means of mitigating the impacts of climate change that we just talked about. And for those of you who are not familiar with them, a composite barrier system is basically a two-layer system of materials of contrasting hydraulic properties. So we have a fine-grained layer of water retention material that overlies a coarse-grained layer of drainage material that prevents infiltration of water into the underlying soil where our buried infrastructure is located. The graph on the right-hand side here shows how that works. So under dry conditions, the rainwater is retained in the fine-grained layer because the hydraulic conductivity of the fine-grained layer is greater than that of the coarse-grained layer. But if we have an extreme rainfall event and we reach a critical point of saturation, then the hydraulic conductivity of the coarse-grained layer eventually surpasses that of the fine-grained layer, and that means that water can get through what we call breakthrough into the buried infrastructure soil layer. So we want that to occur in certain conditions, like if we have an extreme rainfall event, we would want that to occur to prevent the flooding at the surface. But on a day-to-day basis, we would hope to keep our system in the sort of drier end of the spectrum so that we don't get the shrink swell behaviour in the soil underneath. So in order to test these sorts of systems at the laboratory scale, we were able to use the labs at NGIF to test a variety of column experiments. So the column experiments here consisted of a 110mm diameter pipe, and we put different configurations of the composite barrier systems in there. So this is an example in the image here on the right-hand side as well of how those look. So it's usually a coarse-grained layer underlying a fine-grained layer of material. We have suction measured at the boundary between the two layers, so you can see the tensiometer there in the image on the right-hand side. And we also measured the outflow from the base of the column, which we considered breakthrough, using a tipping bucket at the base. We also applied different rainfall events to each of these column experiments, and we could vary that depending on what kind of storm characteristics we were looking at. Particularly in these column experiments, we were interested in testing some sustainable materials. So we wanted to be able to make our composite barrier systems more sustainable and combat the impacts of climate change in a sustainable way. So to do that, we tested some different kinds of materials, including recycled crushed concrete, So this was materials that have previously been used in column experiments before for composite barrier systems, but typically in arid environments, whereas we were testing it in a temperate environment. We also used a water treatment residual amended topsoil. So water treatment residual is just the waste product from treatment of water in reservoirs, and it's usually a waste product, so it doesn't have another use as things stand. And so amending our topsoil with it means that we're increasing the sustainability of the composite barrier system. Now, I won't go into the results of these experiments in any detail, but I will just say that we did recommend the water treatment residual for use in terms of the results that we got from the column experiments, because it increases the water retention of the fine-grained material. But we also found that the regulation of the properties of sustainable materials is not quite there yet, so the results are not reliably repeatable. This is just an example to show you how many different experiments that we can do in the laboratory scale at NGIF. So we did some control experiments. We tested the coarse-grained layer material type and the fine-grained layer material type using a mixture of sustainable materials and just off-the-shelf materials. We looked at using different starting moisture conditions. We looked at different storm intensities, and we tested different geometries of the composite barrier systems. So the next stage here was to move up onto a larger scale, and that brought us to the outside space at the National Green Infrastructure Facility that Ross and Alethea have both talked about this afternoon already. So here, as has already been discussed, we look at using the large-scale experiments, so we can subject these experiments to the natural weather conditions and also to simulated rainfall events as well. So this is the experimental setup that we designed to test the geometry of the composite barrier systems here. So we were looking to consider a balance between performance and cost effectiveness of the two barriers. So each experiment here was a 2 by 2 meter cell, and the first one here on the left hand side has 300 millimeter layer of topsoil, and then a 300 millimeter layer of water treatment residual amended topsoil, and that overlays a gravel drainage layer. And similarly on the right hand side, we just have a 300 millimeter layer of topsoil which is unamended above the drainage layer. The reason for that is because we wanted to use the water treatment residual in the system because we know that it increases the water retention of the fine-grained layer. But we also know from previous research done by some colleagues at Dundee that the plants that we wanted to plant in this setup don't respond particularly well to being planted in the water treatment residual amended topsoil directly. So we wanted to support the plants because they're a really important part of a composite barrier system as well. So in this example, we've used some native plant species, and we used three different functional types, including forbs, grasses, and legumes. And each of these species is adapted to either a European wet meadow or a European dry meadow conditions, so that in dry and wet conditions they should all be working at their optimum, so we can draw the water out of the composite barrier system to effectively reset that relationship between the hydraulic conductivity of the fine and coarse-grained layer. So these experiments are fully instrumented. Alethea showed you some examples of the types of sensors that we use, but in these examples particularly we used some Terros 11 and Terros 12 sensors for the moisture content, which are meter group sensors. And we use some soil suction sensors, including the Terros 21 and Tensiomax sensors. They're all co-located with each other so that we can get an accurate picture of what's going on in the subsurface. We also used a 4-dimensional geophysical monitoring system and installed that into the lysimeters as well to image the subsurface using electrical resistivity tomography. And eventually, once that data's been processed, that'll enable changes in moisture content to be determined from the data. So this is just a quick example of some of the information that we use, some of the results that we got, from the rainfall simulator that we applied to the cactus composite barrier system lysimeter. So this, I don't know if you can see that, This is the rainfall simulator in action. It is a 1 in 100 year plus 45% storm that we applied to the lysimeters. And that's because that's the guidance given to us for how we should design our green infrastructure to account for a 45% uplift due to climate change. So you can see the results on the right-hand side here. Lysimeter A is the shallow lysimeter and lysimeter B is the deep lysimeter, so the one with the greater layer of topsoil. And you can see generally that oh, sorry, no, it's the other way around. So lysimeter A is the deep lysimeter and lysimeter B is the shallow lysimeter. So as a rule, the lysimeter with the greater volume of topsoil performed better in response to the rainfall events that we simulated than the one that had the shallower layer of topsoil. And that's just because it is able to retain more of the moisture that we applied to it. But this is obviously a work in progress and we've got much more data to analyse from this. But just to summarise quickly, the lab facilities at NGIF here we used for a range of column experiment tests. So we used the labs to do some characterisation tests as well, and it's all on a small scale. But we were then able to scale up the experiments using the lysimeters that NGIF has available to us. And it's also very important that we could subject these to natural and simulated weather events, which I think is one of the main attractions of the facilities at NGIF. So thank you very much for listening. Oops, sorry. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you very much to Ross and Alethea and Jessica. Those are really very interesting presentations, and I hope you all have something interesting to ask them. So I'm going to open the floor to questions from people here. Does anyone want to be brave and go first? You do raise your hand or turn your camera on, the usual. Filipos, yes, thank you. Filipos, we can't hear you. Are you on? Are you able to talk right now?
He's written in the chat. Can we hear you?
He's written in the chat.
And the answer is no, I'm afraid. But you could use the chat. Feel free to type it.
Pop it in the chat if you want to.
Okay, green roof monitoring. So right now, none. But historically, in other words, in the last few years, we've had gauging at the bottom. So I mentioned that this on an incline. It's a very shallow system, so it reacts quite quickly. So we've been gauging what came off, but then we also had distributed sensing looking at moisture content and temperature. So there's not a lot much else you can really do given the very limited depth. But it's looking at how quickly you basically get outflow from these systems given the area. Also, it's quite, because it's not the actual very top floor of the building, it's south facing with a wall around it to the sort of all the other directions. It's a bit of an odd one in that you only really capture a lot of water from one direction, and it's not the direction that we tended to get most of the rainfall coming in. And there ends my knowledge on it. I wasn't running that project, I'm afraid. But if green roofs are your interest in particular, I can put you in touch with people who are more into that. So, do you have any particular follow-on? You're way ahead of me, already in the chat. Can you access the data? Yes, I would hope so. I would have to double check what's online. At one point, everything was going online, but obviously as projects come and go, things get replaced or changed. So I'll have to check the app. But I can find the link after this. I'll find the link and I'll put it in the chat for the app and have a look. If it's not there, again, I can put you in touch with the researchers who are involved in that. and see what they've got. If they've got it offline, then they may well be happy to share that directly. Oh, and there's a second half to the thing that didn't pop up. Sorry. Experimental procedure of sensor monitoring. Again, I'll have to put you in touch with the researchers directly involved in that. Yeah, looks like that's probably the best way forward. They'll be able to provide you with all the detail on that. In fact, if you wouldn't mind putting your email address in the chat or something, so that I've got some way of following up, that'd be great. Thank you.
So you mentioned in your talk at the beginning, Ross, about how some of the meadow area was used by staff and students to kind of relax in and kind of like sort of spend time kind of with their lunches and things. Is there any work being done at the moment on that sort of like health and well-being in the kind of green infrastructure space? Is that something that your facility would consider, you know, social scientists and health and well-being experts, etc.?
Yep, so 2 questions in there. 1, no, it's not something we've done. 2, would I consider it? Absolutely. I'm certainly no specialist on the social sciences side of things. It's fair to say so far it's been quite firmly planted in the engineering side of things. That said, we do work with agriculture and School of Computing, looking at the sort of digitizing side of things, working with the data. But so far as the sort of social science side of things goes, it's probably where we've not explored that at all yet. There's perfectly scope to do it. Obviously, the facility outside is part of a bigger scheme, so the Helix site in general has a much greater, much more diverse set of features, but also a set of green infrastructure users. So there's perfect scope to look into that. It's just not something we've done yet.
Because I think that people often have like an affinity with plants, like you would find like Alethea was with kind of the planting of the kind of the greater green structure at Sheffield, and the kind of the fact that people enjoy walking through those areas now, where previously they would never have thought of walking. And these sort of places become more than they once were, just from adding these wonderful kind of green gardened areas.
Oh, absolutely. We have our regulars who come through. You know, there are known faces that come through and have chats. So it's yeah, it as Alethea said, it's a nice place to work most of the time, where people are showing interest. Obviously, there's the occasional person that shows the wrong kind of interest in your work or in the equipment you're working with. But no, there are certain things about it that, particularly different times of the year, particularly when the ducks come, you know, there are people who come down regularly for their walk. Maybe it's a COVID lockdown thing, and people, that was their go-to location for that bit of fresh air. The downside is that we also become quite popular with the dog walkers, which, whenever you're working in soil sciences, is not always a welcome visitor. But yeah, I mean, Alethea and Jess, you're probably out there more often. Have you had good interactions?
Yeah, I feel like there's always people asking what you're doing, and then you direct them to signs and they have a little read, and yeah, they're always interested.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I do know of a case of one couple actually bought a dog specifically because of our facility. They did a lot of lockdown walks and then they decided to get a dog. So I think that's quite a lovely story of how people like definitely interact with the site. Although, as Ross said, having dogs in soil sciences, it's always a welcome visitor in your face when you're trying to get deep into the soil.
And do you have like outreach projects that you do with like local communities and things like that kind of revolve around the science that you're doing?
I wouldn't say we have like direct projects, but we certainly do a lot of outreach. We've done a lot of work with local schools, particularly like one recently was the Weather and Climate Club at Corbridge Middle School, who won a grant with the Royal Society. So we had like a whole afternoon with them where they could learn all about climate science and plants and green infrastructure, and then they got to present it to the Royal Society. And I think that was a really successful scheme. And actually we've written a paper about how great that sort of interaction between universities and schools is, and how sort of we should be working more with them. But we, in general, we have a lot of visitors that come to site as well. And if anyone ever wants a tour, we're always open to doing tours. And we've had a really big variety of people who've had a tour.
Yeah, whether it's organised, or people seem to turn up and then want a bit of a explanation about what's out there. Historically, we've done lots of different things. We were fortunate that in the early days, I think it might have been 2018, we had the Great Exhibition of the North held up here. So we're on a walking trail, and there were signs out there with QR codes that opened up, text conversations, that you could have with a virtual assistant that would talk about green infrastructure, and lots of different initiatives. We've had open days where we've shown people around, members of the public. I've done talks on workers' education authority and association, so adult learning groups and things. Lots of different aspects. There's a local, was it Newcastle and Northumberland Society nearby, and they've written newsletters about it and things. There's a bit of a campaign to sort of build more and save aspects of green infrastructure around the place. So there's a definite impassioned community spirit around it, which is really nice to see, which you probably don't get when your labs are sort of hidden away in university buildings. This is a much more open, public-facing side of things.
I think that's really good, and I think it's kind of, I suppose it maybe brings out the guerrilla gardeners to kind of think about kind of the grey spaces around them and how they could kind of change the kind of the local environment for the better. Did anyone else have any questions for the team here? All very quiet. I'm sure someone thought of something.
I can put the facility email address in the chat, and if anyone thinks of anything after the fact, they're very welcome to get in touch.
That'd be perfect. I do think kind of, oh, brilliant. That's great. Thank you, Ross. I think kind of with the kind of the current water butts. Ah, yeah, good question, Tracy.
Yeah, so water butts is sort of like a mix, really. So there's two types of rainwater harvesting. There's passive and there's active. So active is like in a new development, we can make this like new shiny system that can collect all the water, and it can like pump it through your house for your toilet flushing, your washing machines, and your car washing. And then passive is what we can just do in a retrofit. So it's just a water butt we put on the outside, and it can definitely alleviate flooding. But the risk with a water butt is that we want to hold water in our water butts because we want to use it to water our garden, and that's sort of the opposite of what we need for a storm. So I would say if you're going to put a water butt in your garden, make sure you're monitoring the news and the weather alerts, because if there's a big storm coming, you want to empty your water butt into like buckets and things around your garden, because then you're then going to have a nice big storage container to hold all that water. And I suppose as well, the problem with water butts is that it's sort of like the opposite seasons to what we want things to be happening in. So we're emptying them lots and lots in summer when it's more dry, and then we're like leaving them to fill up lots in winter because we don't really need to water our plants as much. So I think they can certainly do things to alleviate flooding, but I think there is a risk of them not being used properly. And I think people need lots of education, I suppose, to help use water butts. I know some water companies are trying to encourage people to use water butts, but I think it's all had like sort of limited success because of these issues. So yeah, I think definitely go for it, because it's always good to harvest rainwater and to hold rainwater and reuse rainwater, but definitely keep an eye on those storm alerts, really.
Excellent. Fantastic. I think, yeah, as the more kind of strong kind of our different, as the climate's changing, I think you are going to get more of these kind of extremes in weather, and I think it's really very important to have kind of this research that kind of says kind of how can we kind of make our towns and cities more resilient to this. And I think kind of this green infrastructure is a really interesting way of kind of doing it. You kind of get the double benefit of yeah, nice places to be visually and kind of good for the health, etc., as well as yeah, serving this greater purpose. So I think it's great. I look forward to coming and visiting your site at some point and having a little tour around. So yeah, thank you very much. And if anyone else has any questions, feel free to email the team at Green Infrastructure. So yeah, thank you very much. We hope to run another one of these webinars in the new year. We're going to kind of do a bit of a spotlight on a number of the UKCRIC facilities and teams around the country, all doing their various different research areas. So if there's anyone you'd particularly like to hear from, then feel free to drop me an email and I can make arrangements to have a meeting or a seminar from various different sites. Otherwise, just keep an eye out to the newsletters and my event sheets that kind of come out. And yeah, feel free to tell your friends about and colleagues and other students in your networks about the Doctoral Skills Network, as we want to try and support as many PGR students and early career researchers in our institutions as possible. So thank you all very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Okay, thanks, Jenny.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye. Bye.